Hey everyone, today we're going to have a discussion with Stacy Russo. Stacy is a writer, artist, poet, librarian slash professor at a college. And what's really cool is she's an old friend of mine from high school days. Way back in the high school, we went to animal rights protests together with James, Turkey, and a bunch of other friends. Fender's Ballroom with Rini. We went to shows at Fender's, Olympic. We went to the Nevada test site in the 80s.
Yeah.
And you're gonna trip out on this. In the 80s, when we're in high school, she was doing a zine. Fanzine is like a paper, like a newsprint fanzine. We're not just talking about a couple, like 20 or 30 copies. We're talking about boxes, huge boxes.
That's true.
Oh man, it's like huge, big boxes of zines and zines. We're gonna discuss about that. Also, she also put out with us and friends, James, everyone. We put out like, wow, countless of veggie picnics, punk rock veggie picnics, and everything. Okay, before we discuss, sorry, I'm doing this in first take, but anyway, before we start the discussion, I want to get your opinion about this because I was talking to my friends about this because a lot of my old friends are saying how 80s were so tough, like growing up in the 80s. Like, you had rednecks who hated punk rockers, you had jocks who hated punk rockers. Pretty much everybody was like how tough it was. But I told them, I think kids growing up now are facing more crazy things from the 80s. I mean, it blows away 80s and 90s because a few months ago, somebody posted this on Facebook. It was like a meme. It says like, we're facing everything at once. Great Depression, the Spanish flu, Watts riot, civil rights movement, and recently we had the fires and everything in 2020. What do you think? Do you think 2020 is the more craziest for teenagers to face, or was it the 80s?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there were a lot of these problems and these different forms of injustice have always been with us. So I feel like every generation has had these struggles. And I think when we were growing up in the 80s, Ronald Reagan was president, and there also was not much of a focus on animal rights at that time. So some things have improved somewhat in regards to people's awareness, perhaps. But I do feel that, to be honest, that the world we live in right now is very scary, and the current president is absolutely terrifying to me and many people. And climate change and what we're seeing with, like you were mentioning, the fires, the hurricanes, all these things happening. I imagine if I was a teenager now, I would be very politically active and scared of my future. So I don't think it's gotten better. And that's part of the reason that the book I did, the title is We Were Going to Change the World. Not that we changed the world, unfortunately, because I do feel all of these major issues are still with us. And so, I mean, when you talk about being punk rock, I think it's easier to be punk rock now than it was then, because it's much more accepted to look different or to have different hair and all that kind of stuff like that. It's almost like mainstream. But in terms of the political climate and problems in the world, I do feel that it's worse now.
Also, can you tell about, I mean, in high school, normally kids think about their career and stuff, but you guys were all thinking about changing the world. Tell us about the all-woman issue of anti-establishment fanzine you were doing with Rini, and then to the City Indians fanzine. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that's great, Jay, that you just said that, because I remember being in high school and a lot of our peers were concerned about getting a house or a nice car, having a family, getting a career, like you said, and all those things. And none of that really interested me at all. I was definitely not thinking of that stuff. I wasn't concerned about consumer culture and buying things or anything like that. I was very much involved in political activism, and the zines were really a part of that, what we called fanzines, because, and it's amazing to think back on that we were so young, right? Like 15, 16, 17, and we were writing all these articles about the government, about war, about animal rights, about feminism. And the fact that there were so many young guys that were into like feminism and stuff, you know, it's just really amazing to think of that. And I'm so thankful for punk rock and growing up in the scene, because it's probably the largest influence on the rest of my life. I'm so glad that I wasn't 16 and worried about a career and a house only. I'm so glad that I was worried about the world and problems in the world, and that's always stayed with me.
How did you network with other punks in the 80s when there was no phone, no cell phone, no internet?
That's amazing to think of that, because it just blows me away to think that we found out about shows. We would all gather somewhere, you'd see people you knew, and you know, how did everybody find out about stuff? So I mean, one thing about punk rock was I had so many pen pals. There was this huge network of pen pals around the world. I mean, I had a lot of pen pals in the US, but even in other countries. And we would write letters to each other through the regular mail about our lives growing up punk rock. And you would find people like that in places like the classified ads in Flipside, or perhaps in Maximum Rock and Roll, and then you'd write to people. And you know, you'd go to record stores and see flyers, or you'd hear about shows from your friends. So you just heard about stuff, and it just all worked out. You know, we all were able to get together, and you could call people on the phone, of course, and leave a message if you didn't reach them. I mean, social media is really great, but people were still very connected back then too. You know, there were ways to do it.
All right, Stacy, another thing I wanted to ask you about was, I've been debating with my friends about this. We had some disagreement. The punk shows in the 80s and now, because there were, so many people like glorify the 80s punk rock, oh, how great the 80s was. And I said, what are you talking about, man? 80s when we were 15, 16, even when we go to the show, we were like minors. We couldn't even see the bands, all these tall people in front of us, you know, and then there's crazy things going on. But now I told them, before the pandemic happened, now when we go to shows, it's more like bigger venue. Even if you don't go to show, you can watch it on YouTube. You have the internet, people always record, but it's more enjoyable. What was punk shows like in the 80s? And do you like this, the scene and the shows better in the 80s or now?
Yeah, I noticed a lot of differences. I don't go to that many shows anymore, but I have gone to some. I'm 50 years old, so I have gone to some shows at this age. You know, I think when people talk about the 80s, they're probably very nostalgic because they're remembering their youth, you know, and that's really a part of it. It's kind of tied into the memories, and that could be why they feel like it was better. The thing about the 80s and the 70s, I guess, for people who are older than us, is you were at more of the beginning of something, right? So you were kind of more at the early stages of something. And that's really exciting, I think, to think of. When students find out I went to shows in the 80s, they're like, oh my God, you went to shows in the 80s, you know? Like, it sounds like a fascinating time period to them. A big difference I've noticed, although like I said, I don't go to a lot of shows now, but whenever I've gone to shows now, There's no violence there, or very little violence if there is. And people kind of seem maybe a bit nicer to each other and stuff. I think in the 80s, it was really rough. There was definitely a lot of violence, unfortunately. Some of that was from gangs and people like that, but some of it was also from the police, that's for sure. The riot police came a lot to the shows. So I guess for some women that I interviewed for my one book, they felt like going to shows in the 80s wasn't really safe for them. They didn't feel safe at the shows because of the violence. I didn't really feel like that myself at all. I had a lot of fun, but going to shows now, it's not as scary, you know, like it just seems more calm in a way. And I don't know, it's an interesting question though, because it doesn't feel like it has the same intensity or energy to me when I go now as it did back then. But that could be because I was so young then. It's hard to know.
All right. Another thing I want to bring up is this. Since we're talking about the 80s, not just punk rockers, even animal rights activists that I knew and met who were not into punk, a lot of them changed. A lot of them went back to eating meat, or even activists who used to direct action towards animal rights fully got out of it. I want to know, how all these years, how did you stay committed to animal rights and still vegan and stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. So I became vegetarian first in 1986. And then many years after that, I became vegan. So I've been vegan for a long time now. So I haven't eaten meat since 1986. I never once have eaten meat since then. It's really central to who I am, being vegan. It's so important to my life. And, you know, being vegan is not a diet, although people will unfortunately sometimes say that or think that. It's really a whole way of life, of trying to live your life not causing harm as much as you can. I think that, you know, being an activist and taking a stance against something that the majority of people don't agree with takes a lot of resilience, a lot of inconvenience perhaps. It's not supposed to be easy always. I have to say being vegan is very, very easy. And I love it. It gives me daily joy. But this question is interesting to me. I feel, I'll just quickly say, I feel there are two reasons that people move away from being an activist and doing the right thing. I think it's because of pleasure and convenience. I feel like if somebody finds something so pleasurable, it's almost like an addiction. And if it's very accepted by society, then it takes a lot for someone to walk away from that. And I feel like people just give into that. And they give into what's more convenient for them in their life as well. So I think those are two reasons. But I honestly think though that most people, not everybody, but I do think most people don't think it's okay to eat animals, but they still do it. You know, somehow they're able to psychologically allow themselves to do that. But I think if we were to go out to dinner and we had some friends with us who were gonna order hamburgers or chicken or whatever, and we told them, okay, you're gonna go around back and there's a cute little chicken out there and a cow, and you're gonna slaughter them, and then after you kill the animals, you can come back into the restaurant and they're gonna cook them up for you. I really think most people would not be able to do that. And they wouldn't eat the animals then and at that moment. I just think a lot of it's so hidden from people that they just go along with the flow of what's accepted and don't question it. I mean, there's so many ways to answer this question. I could talk about it forever, but that's just kind of, it's upsetting to me though, the question, because especially if somebody was so committed and then they walked away from that. that is really discouraging and upsetting. You know, there's no way around it. I would imagine they probably, if they were involved with anti-racist action or feminist action as well at the time, I doubt they're racist now or sexist now. But when it comes to animals, they're kind of the last beings that people can easily be okay with harming.
Stacy, like I just tell people who used to be X, I just say, oh, thank you for fighting for the animal rights in the past, and I just move on. I don't put anybody down or anything because I got so used to it. But look, check out my shirt.
I see that. That's good. I mean, that's great. You can do that. I don't ever really get in arguments with people, and I just want to say too that, you know, I'm not just a vegan. I am also committed to all kinds of causes, right? So besides animals, I didn't want it to sound like I'm not concerned about racism or whatever. I'm very concerned about all those things, of course. But people can get really angry if you try to talk about veganism, you know, and you know, being vegan, you get made fun of. People like to poke fun, stuff like that, like at work or whatever. It takes a lot of courage to stay committed to something. I don't know why people fall away. It's very complicated.
Oh, Stacy, speaking of that, I gotta tell you something funny. It was me and James were going to La Vista High School. So when James and I were going to high school, I was telling the teacher something that I'm going vegan. They didn't know what a vegan was. Vegan wasn't popular back then. What is that? Vegetarian. You go,
right.
You could die. She was like, you could die. She was saying, oh my gosh, you could die from that. You better be careful. I just find that crazy.
I know, I've heard stuff like that.
And you would die. You'd starve to death.
Yeah, it's really funny because usually almost the first thing people tell you is, oh, you're not going to get enough protein. You know, you're going to like fade away or something. But I can assure people, I've been eating meat for, I don't know what that is now, 34 years or something. I don't know. I'm totally fine, and I do a lot.
All right, Stacy, before we get into your books, I want to discuss two more things with you. I don't know what year it was, but I wasn't there. A couple of years ago, you set up your table at the Los Angeles Anarchist Book Fair. Tell me about your experience from that and to see the whole new generation of activists and stuff. It was like so tell me about your experience from the Los Angeles Anarchist Book Fair, how you felt.
Yeah, I had a wonderful time there. I had, I believe I had my vegan cupcakes and muffins that I make, and I also had my books and zines there. And I love things like that anarchist book fair because you see a lot of different generations of people, like you were saying, together who are committed to social justice. And I'm also very active in going to zine festivals. And sometimes I'm one of the older people. I don't think of myself as older though, but I know I am. I must look older, but I feel very young. So I think it's great to be involved with what young people are doing like that. And it's inspiring. And I also just like to be involved in places where you see people of all different ages who are committed. So that was a wonderful event. They had all kinds of talks and vendors and food and everything there.
Oh, another thing I want to bring up is I moved up here about 8 years ago, or 7 or 8 years ago. And at that time, when I first moved up here in Northern California, this is going to be interesting. I was working as a lifeguard at UC Berkeley at the Olympic-sized swimming pool. And then my partner, she was studying there for psychology and stuff. But the thing is, when she was going there and when I was working there, it was crazy. I didn't even see a single punk rock, no alternative, no emo, no gangster, not even hipsters. It were just all like nerds. Like everyone a lot of foreign exchange students, these students were so serious about studying. That's all I saw. And what was it like? What was it like when you when you went to UC Berkeley? What was it like? Was it punkster back then or what?
Yeah, I do remember there were punk rockers there. When I went to UC Berkeley, I transferred there from the community college down here in Southern California, and so I was still going to punk shows. I looked, I didn't have a mohawk, but I still had, like short, like bleached out hair, and wore some punk kind of looking stuff. So I would go to Gilman Street sometimes to see shows back then. So that would have been like around 91, I guess, by the time I got to Berkeley. And as soon as, the reason I wanted to go to Berkeley was because I knew about the history of activism. And that was my dream to go to school there because of that. And I was involved in different activism on campus. I was actually, believe it or not, I'm a librarian now, right? You mentioned at a college. I was once arrested at the library at UC Berkeley during a protest. The charges were dropped by the university, but I got involved too with animal rights activism with some other students that were involved with punk rock as well. So I was definitely very serious with my studies. And when I went to Berkeley, I actually stopped partying. I used to drink a lot as a teenager. I completely stopped doing that. I stopped smoking cigarettes. I got very focused on studying, but I would still go often on the evenings or the weekend to see punk shows while I was going to classes there.
That's cool. I was just wondering, did all the punks stop going to university because there's internet now, so all the young kids are learning more online instead of going to college now, or what?
No, actually, where I am at the community college, Santa Ana College, I see a lot of students with punk rock. They look punk rock, like the shirts they wear and stuff like that. They're very much also into activism, and I've met some great students, because of the shirts they're wearing, and I talk to them, and it's primarily a Latino culture at the college, and very much into the old bands and all. So I asked them when they have the t-shirt on, hey, do you really know that band? Because some people will wear a shirt and not even know who the band is, right? And if it's some band that's not even that well known, like English Dogs or something, I'm like, how did you find this shirt? But they often do know the band and they love the music. And I think punk rock was such a large social political movement, right? And with the music and the art and all, and there hasn't really been maybe something that large with all of those elements to it since then. So they're really drawn to that. And some students I've met even have started bands and stuff like that, like punk bands. And they're like 18 years old and stuff. So yeah.
Oh, Stacy, before we talk about you, one more thing I want to mention was I picture Northern California like really radical with all the hippies, because this is where Summer of Love happened in 1967. Because when I was at UC, working at UC Berkeley, I was going, God, this job is so boring. Where are all the crazy hippies? Where did all the hippies go? That's I was mentioning that.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I noticed too. Things like vegan restaurants and stuff. I actually think Los Angeles is even better than the Bay Area for like vegan food and stuff like that. But people would think the opposite. They would think, oh, San Francisco, Berkeley is probably like, and there are a ton of great vegan things up there, but gosh, LA is like awesome for all that kind of food, and so, the Bay Area is also very expensive. So expensive to live in the Bay Area. It's expensive here too. It's in California in general, but up there, I don't even know how people can pay the rent up there. It's so expensive.
All right. Now we're going to talk about your book. The background right here is we were going to change the rule book. You did interview with a woman from the 70s and 80s from the Southern California punk scene. Can you tell us about the book?
Yeah. I mean, I won't give the big whole long story, but I'll just say that I wanted to do a project where I interviewed other women like me who are now in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, or even older, who grew up in the punk rock scene around here. And I wanted to ask them about their lives and how they were involved and if it ended up influencing the rest of their life in any way. And a big thing about the book is I wanted to include all different types of women who were involved in different ways. A lot of times, the people whose stories we hear are, often men, often white men, and often the musicians only. And then there might be a few of the more famous women musicians who are interviewed. But you don't often hear about like the fans, like all the people in the audience. You don't often hear as much from artists or journalists or photographers, people that were involved in the scene in all these different ways. So the book does include a lot of fans. So it includes the audience, which was a big part of punk rock, and as well as women who did fanzines and so on. So it includes musicians too, but I really wanted to present all different ways that made it a movement, right?
Oh, Stacy, I was so happy to see our friend Rini in there.
Yeah,
Our high school friend Rini. We used to go to shows with her all the time. And
yes,
party with her too.
yes.
But I didn't drink back then or smoke. You guys partied.
I
Oh,
know, you were so much better than us. Oh my goodness.
I wasn't better, but also, I don't know if you know that Ziggy, I was so happy to see Ziggy in there. I met her when I was in junior high school in Los Angeles.
Yeah, yeah. So Rini, is my best friend growing up. So I met her when I was 15, and we were punk rock girls together, going to shows and everything. And she was the first person I told about the project. I want to do this book project. And she was also the first woman I interviewed. All the other women in the book, if I remember correctly, I didn't know any of them until I interviewed them. So, and I met most of them in person at their home and interviewed them there.
I think you saw Nature Corp, but you never talked to Tammy.
No, I didn't know Tammy back then.
Yeah, but you probably saw the band.
It's
We went to so
possible,
many
yeah.
shows. Also, another book, A Better World Starts Here, Activists and the Work. This book came out last year.
Yeah, it came out last year.
Tell us about this book.
So this is a book that is definitely inspired from growing up in the punk rock scene, because what punk rock gave me that's so important to my life is the awareness of all the different forms of oppression in the world and how we need to work against all of them, right? So you can't just only be concerned with animal rights. You can't just only be concerned with gender discrimination or environment. You have to really be aware of all the forms of injustice and work against them. So that book includes interviews with 25 amazing activists from mostly the United States, but also other countries, who are doing all different types of activism work. So some is vegan activism, some is trans activism, some is feminist, some is more rooted in anti-racist action or using art as activism. So all different types. So it's to show people how creative you can be with activism, all the different ideas to inspire. And it's also pointing out how, again, all these forms of oppression are interconnected and we have to work against all of them.
Stacy, speaking of feminism, like since the 70s, burn your bra, to 80s, 90s to now, why is to this day in the mainstream media feminism has such a bad rep and people are making fun of it? I'm talking about the mainstream people and stuff.
Yeah,
From the 70s, 80s, it continues.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the word feminist, it's similar though to like what we see now with the Black Lives Matter movement, where the right-wing conservative media uses these terms and these concepts in a wrong way. It's not an accurate understanding of these movements or these ideologies, and they present that out there, and it creates these negative views then of these things that are actually very positive and life affirming. And it's all about power in some ways and who has the power. And feminism, people will sometimes ask me, why do you need feminism now? Look at you, you have a good job. You could go to college, you can drive a car, you could do whatever. But you know, there's still a lot of places in the world where that's not true for women. And then the other thing is, it's not true that I can do everything the same really as a man, simply for the fact that there's rape and violence against women, right? So but there's a lot of hatred against women, and there's a lot of internalized hatred that women have for themselves, unfortunately, that comes out. That's why you can see a woman politician or somebody who's actually anti-feminist. She's like internalized the negative views and about feminism or women, and hates herself really in a way, you know. But that's a good point that you mentioned, Jay, because similar to the animals, a lot of people are okay with the fact that there's a lot of violence. I mean, they must be okay with it, but there's a lot of violence and hatred towards women, because otherwise, why would they be upset about feminism, about equality? It helps all of us when everybody's free, right? It helps all of us be more free as people. So it's about power ultimately.
Yes. And sometimes I get confused. I was thinking, why this person against feminism? If it wasn't feminist, they won't be able to vote or have the job and all that stuff. And that's what they fought for a long time ago during the suffrage. But here's an interesting one. A book you put out called Love Activism book. And this interesting was 8 elements of love activism. I wrote it down. Service, empathy, nonviolence, self-care, hope, creativity, feminism, mindfulness. Can you tell us about this book?
Yeah, so many years ago, I developed the idea of love activism. Not that I'm the first person that thinks love's a core part of activism at all. But I just realized how love is such a big word, and it goes way beyond romantic love, right? It goes into how we treat other people in general, how we treat all beings, the environment, our communities, and so on. So love activism is about practicing a very radical and daily form of love in your life in regards to what you eat, how you act towards people, what you do for a living, all those elements. And I really think of love as non-harm, doing what you can to not harm the world, other people, and so on. Not that you have to be perfect, we're not perfect, but that you try to work towards that. So those elements you mentioned, I was thinking, what would all the different elements be of love activism if somebody was going to practice it? And that's where those elements came up that you mentioned. And in the book, I have all these different things you can do in your life that are tied to some of those elements, right? Like feminism or service and so on.
I just think that is important because I was self-care and everything, because I had a talk with my friend yesterday about this. the thing is now in 2020 with all this social media, this people who have toxic behavior on social media, and also all kind of false information going around,
Yeah.
crazy most conspiracy videos and blaming this,
Yes.
blaming that. Like it just messes up like kids growing up seeing this kind of stuff. And when I go on Facebook and I see people say, "Oh, I'm depressed," it's like messing people up and everything because of that. That's why I think that's really important. All the stuff you mentioned,
Yes.
self-care and all that.
I agree. Yeah, self-care is so important. And even as an activist, if you don't practice self-care, you're going to get burned out probably. And you might walk away from your activism or just kind of, give up. But if you can try to take care of yourself, then you can be more resilient.
Oh, to rewind a little bit, you also talk about being a librarian. Aren't you also a professor at a college?
It's both. Librarians at community colleges are usually also professors. So, and the college where I'm at, there's a whole program related to library science. We call it library technology. So I teach in that program, and I'm the chair of that program. So teaching is a part of being a librarian at a lot of places.
Also, you gotta excuse me. It just stuck in my head earlier. You were saying how rent went sky high and everything, how expensive Northern California and everything.
Yeah.
I just want to give young folks a little bit hint. In the old days when I was young and stuff, what we did is, even when we're young, what we did is we lived together with friends in apartments, with friends, then to the co-op house. That's
Yeah.
how we survived in the old.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah,
giving.
I thought of the rent because of people who are activists and artists and writers and all. I was just, concerned about how they would be able to afford to live in certain places. I mean, obviously, like what you're saying is one way to make it work. I mean, even like New York City has so many amazing activists and artists and all, but that's even more expensive, than the Bay Area.
Yes. Okay, Stacy, I was reading the website and there's other poetry books you put out and another book you edit which has Angela Davis for. What are some other things I didn't bring up you did, some of your work?
Thank you. Well, I mean, you've mentioned a lot. So yeah, I'm also a poet, and that actually, the first things I would do with my poetry do come from out of punk rock. Because in the fanzines, we would sometimes write poems and had poetry in there. And then I did poetry fanzines, entirely only my poems, as a teenager or like around age 20 or whatever, all out of punk rock. So poetry's a big part of my life, and art, creating art is as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this interview discussion with Stacy. And if anybody wants to check out her website, check out this link right over here. That's her website. And check out her books too. On their website has lists of all the books and poetry and amazing things she did. Thank you very much, Stacy.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you
I
stay
hope you
safe.
have a great day. You too. Bye.